it's not for the record. So my idea is first we do a blog. I ask you, Buddhism came to the West, and there you can talk a little bit more, like you start on Friday.
Oh, last night.
On Friday, yeah. So it came really early, not too much details. And then also you 40 years theory, yeah. So, and then we will go to some questions more.
Okay.
Yeah, hello Stephen. Thanks that you give me the opportunity to have an interview with you. We are here in Berlin and have a seminar, and I really liked your talk last night, and you was talking about how Buddhism came to the West. So we can say in simple terms what's happened so far. I know it's hard. If you ask you, can you repeat it in like 10 minutes? But try it. Yeah. So the question is, what happened so far between West and the Buddhism? And later we want to look what could be happened. What happened so far?
When we consider the history of the relation between Buddhism, Buddhist cultures in Asia, and how they have arrived in the modern West, it's actually quite a short story. From the time of the Buddha until the beginning of the 19th century, Western Europe had really no idea of what Buddhism was about at all. And it took all that time, which is effectively 2,000 years, before the first texts. It took about 2,000 years before the first texts of a non-European culture were translated into Latin and French and so on. So Buddhism arrives on the horizon of the West around the end of the Buddhism arrives on the horizon of the West towards the end of the 18th century. We first get translations of Upanishads, which are not Buddhist, but nonetheless, they're the first time Europeans have been able to experience a rich philosophical culture that is not European or Jewish or Greek. The first Buddhist texts, the first time we got reliable accounts of Buddhism was around 1840, when a book was published in French by Eugène Burnouf called The Introduction to Indian Buddhism. And there, for the first time, a Western scholar who had mastered Sanskrit and Pali was able to present Buddhist philosophy in terms of the original Buddhist texts themselves. And this was an enormous breakthrough. And all manner of people, like the philosopher Schopenhauer, were completely taken by this. We then have, about 40 years after that, 1880, we have the founding of the Theosophical Society, which at the time, again, was an enormously influential movement, founded by Helena Blavatsky and Colonel Henry Steele Olcott. And they tried to create a religion that drew upon the different religions of the world, was believed to be completely compatible with science, the new theory of evolution, which was becoming accepted at that point. But they did give particular emphasis to Buddhism. In fact, Blavatsky and Olcott went to Sri Lanka in about 1886, I think it was, and formally received the lay precepts from a Buddhist monk in Gal in Sri Lanka, becoming, I think, probably the first lay people to formally become Buddhists, as it were. We move forward, we get small Buddhist monasteries starting in Asia with Westerners, we get the first Buddhist societies in the West, and around the 1920s, I think, we get the first established Buddhist center in Europe, which is here in Frohnau, in Berlin, founded by Dr. Paul Dahlke. Still exists today, although now it's run by Sri Lankans. And so we get, at that point, Westerners in Europe actually beginning to try to figure out, what is this philosophy? How could I actually live it? They see it not as a curiosity, but they see it as something that can inform their lives. The next great jump really is in the 1960s. And this, of course, is my own generation, where we came of age in a newly affluent post-war situation. We had disposable incomes, and we had a spirit and a climate of optimism in the 1960s, where people felt that kind of anything was possible. And younger people in particular, you know, rejecting the Vietnam War, rejecting capitalism very often, inspired by Indian music, by Indian ideas. The Beatles go and stay with Maharishi and so on. And so as a whole generation of young people go off to India in the 60s and 70s and for the first time start to actually train as Buddhist monks and nuns and dedicate their lives to understanding Buddhism. Again, this is, at least on that scale, this has never happened before. And consequently, when these people, this generation of young people came back to America, to Australia, to Europe and so on, they established centres, they invited Tibetan lamas and Zen masters and so on, and began really the flourishing of Buddhism in our culture as we know it today. Now, what struck me when I was...
I need a short break.
You need a short break?
Stop this.
Okay.
And the battery is not so good, and I'm not sure this is recording. Let's stop it. Okay. Okay. And I have a wish. Can you move a little bit like this, that your shoulders are more... in the opposite way? Yeah.
Like that?
That's better.
Okay.
Okay.
So I just continue where we...
We was by the 60s.
Yeah, so... but when I look back on this process of Buddhism coming into the West, I noticed that there seemed to be roughly 40-year intervals. You have 1800, 1840, 1880, 1920, 1960. In other words, slightly more than a generation, and there seems to be a kind of a new wave of interest. A new sort of level is reached in terms of Buddhism becoming incorporated into our Western cultural understanding. And I wrote a book about this, which was published in the 1994, I think. And what puzzled me at that time was, well, if this 40-year theory has any validity, then around the year 2000, there should be another new wave. But even in 1992, 93, I had no idea what this could be. I was clueless. And it even worried me that perhaps this is as far as Buddhism will ever get. But when I look back in retrospect now, you know, in 2016, and I look back at the year 2000 and what followed immediately after that, it is now to me entirely obvious what that next wave would be, or was. And that is the spread of mindfulness. The mainstreaming of mindfulness in Western culture was something I could not have foreseen even a few years before it happened. It came as a profound shock, probably a similar kind of shock to the first introduction to the story of the Buddha and the Buddha's teaching would have been for Victorians living in the 19th century. This was completely unforeseeable, that mindfulness would be practiced in healthcare, mindfulness would be practiced in business, in the military, in pretty much every area of modern life. And it was so quick. Suddenly it's everywhere. It's on the front cover of Time magazine. We have American congressmen writing books, A Mindful Nation, and all this kind of stuff. The British Parliament, they run mindfulness courses in the Parliament there. I mean, it's quite weird. If you had told me back in the 1970s that in 40 years' time you could get Buddhist meditation on the National Health Service, I would have thought such a person was crazy, you know, just a fantasist. But it has actually happened. So what this does, it not only confirms the sense that Buddhism is coming at us in waves, it also, I think, serves as a kind of validation for some of those intuitions that myself and others had back in the 70s when we were confused young kids, basically, that there was something here which was more than just a passing fad, some kind of fashion. We do seem to be tapping into the sources of a non-European culture which are quite rapidly becoming internalized in people's lives and becoming embodied not only in Buddhist centers but also in mindfulness training places. And I don't know where this is going in the long term, But I have more and more confidence that this is really a significant cultural movement that will probably take many decades yet to work itself out. I feel very inspired by that. I feel very confirmed in my own, intuitions and convictions that this is taking place.
Would you like to describe the picture what we have now? There's on one hand this mindfulness movement.
Yeah.
I think also not all people are aware of this. So you can a little bit describe what is this? And on the other hand, I'm interested how you want to draw this picture. I think we have all the major lineages available here. If you go to a city up to 500,000 people, you will find a Zen. So where we are now.
Well, I think if you try to sort of, try to get a picture of where we are now, imagine that you live in Berlin or any city of any size in the West. You will find within probably a 10-minute taxi ride a Tibetan center, a Zen center, a Theravada center, maybe a Pure Land center, a couple of places that are teaching mindfulness. And this again is quite remarkable, not just because all of these things are available within any large city of our time, but because this meeting of Buddhist traditions has never happened before. In Asia, if you were born in Korea, for example, all you would ever know about Buddhism would be Korean Zen. If you were born in, let's say, in Tibet, all you would know, basically, would be the Tibetan lineage that happened to be run the monastery in the valley in which you live. And your knowledge of other forms of Buddhism would be effectively zero, or it would be some sort of sectarian prejudice that these people are not real Buddhists or they are some inferior vehicle or whatever. By coming to the West, Buddhism has had to encounter itself. Tibetan lamas, Theravada monks, Zen priests find themselves at DBU gatherings. There is no longer this separation into these different national forms of the Dharma. Instead, we're exposed to the richness and the diversity of the traditions, which is both something very engaging, but it also is somewhat threatening. Because each Buddhist tradition, like most religious groupings, tends to think that it and it alone has the real thing, the true Dharma, as it were. It's very difficult to sustain that argument when you're living right next door to all these different groups. And for Western people, I think it's not easy to believe that my particular form of Zen, for example, is the only true form of Buddhism there is. I meet too many other Buddhists who are equally as kind and wise and compassionate as the people I know in my tradition. So it actually is questioning, what is this tradition all about? And the mindfulness movement, which has sprung up in the last 10-15 years really, and continues to keep on growing, is again throwing another element into this mix. That now, a very central Buddhist practice, that of mindful awareness, is now being practiced by people who don't even consider themselves Buddhists. In fact, it's deliberately being separated from its Buddhist origins and being presented as a therapeutic intervention or strategy. But many people who encounter this form of meditation, maybe for health reasons or whatever, find that actually it does more than just solve my current psychological problem or makes me more able to work better with my colleagues at work. But it actually affords another perspective on my life as a whole. This mindful awareness opens up a space within our inner experience, a space of stillness, a space of clarity, and a space in which the deeper questions about life are able to arise and be attended to for many people, and again I don't know the exact numbers, but certainly I find when I teach a retreat today, a meditation retreat, a good number of the participants will not have come from the Buddhist world or even an interest in Buddhism. They will have come because they've had already a life-changing experience that they wish to develop and wish to deepen. So this is now playing into the mix, as it were. And I think that's it's very brief, but I think that gives you at least some picture of how Buddhism is playing out in the modern world.
And is there a chance that this movement goes more to what we Buddhists will call Buddhism, or will it be a feature of modern capitalism?
I don't underestimate the power. I don't underestimate the power of religions to survive. And I suspect that most forms of Buddhism, like Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, these are not going to, they're not going to fade away. They will persist in some form. But I think that the traditional Asian forms of Buddhism will always have a certain difficulty in really becoming integral to modernity. So it's unlikely that they will develop into large-scale cultural movements. The mindfulness phenomenon, however, could become just, as you say, a feature of something that helps us be better consumers and capitalists. Personally, I think that's unlikely, but it could. But I feel that the mindfulness movement now affords an opportunity, and it may not be an opportunity that will last for very long, whereby the Buddhist community can try to articulate a value system, an ethic, a philosophy, a psychology, drawing on Buddhist sources, but reframing them in a non-religious language that can provide a mindfulness practitioner with a much richer environment or context within which to further develop their mindfulness practice. And I've noticed that a lot of the mindfulness people are coming to their own instructors and teachers to ask them to provide a richer framework for their practice. And the teachers of the teachers, as it were, will then call upon people like myself and my colleagues and invite us actually to bring in Buddhist ideas, not in a religious language, but in a more secular language that is true to the insights of the Buddha, I feel, and yet speaks to people who are not identified as Buddhists.
If we look in history, so what happens if Buddhists came from Tibet to China? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's too romantic, but maybe to this time we can say there was discussions or there was a dialogue between the culture, the Buddhist culture, what entered into China, and this culture what was still there, Taoist culture or whatever. So if we see this and we consider ourselves in a similar situation, I would looking for discussions, but just now it's not happened. Maybe it's my view. So if I Google in Germany Buddhists, I found you can say to every teacher one organization, e.V. E.V. Even in Nyingma, you have like 5 organizations. To every single teacher, another one. And I think they not know each other. Or if you look to this, I think one of the largest group in Germany. So from my feelings, I'm not sure about this, but I think it's Alle, nicht. I think they have the most centers, most people. And before a couple of weeks I was in Salzburg and I was meet the Alle, nicht center, and there was nice people there, but I was really seeing they don't know anything about something outside of Alle, nicht. I was asking this guy, well, what are you doing if Alle, nicht is dying? And he was looking to me like a devil. What are you talking about? I wonder about this. I wonder, and I was asking these people, do you feel as a Buddhist or as a Karma Kagyu? Yeah? Then I'm also Buddhist, but from the Theravada. So are we a we or not? And he was disturbed by this question. Isn't it a natural need now that we start to discuss, and then who are the actors? So from my view, if you look to China, there must be scientific, modern, or that there must be forces that represent our culture. The question is, what is this? I think you are one of these figures. I will say you can represent our way of critical thinking. And who are the other ones? And how many years it will be take and we have this dialogue? Or is it still starting and I'm not seeing it?
I think there is a dialogue emerging now between Buddhist teachers and practitioners and representatives of Western culture. A good example of this would be the Mind and Life Institute that has now for the last 2 years held a summer school in Chiemsee in southern Germany, where Buddhist teachers, Mathieu Ricard, Tsoknyi Rinpoche and other teachers come together with scientists, particularly cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, and engage in a really in-depth dialogue between these two different traditions. And that is a very healthy thing. But we also find, as you suggested, that many Buddhist groups are actually seem to be more intent on preserving their isolation as a particular school or sub-school of some tradition, and are rather defensive and rather reluctant to engage in a conversation not only with Western scientists or artists or whatever, but even with other Buddhists. So I think we see these two tendencies, that there's a tension, as it were. And this is characteristic also of Buddhism in Asia. I had a friend who was staying in a Japanese monastery in Kyoto, and every morning when he woke up, he heard from across the road another temple starting their morning bells and chants and so on. And after a little while, he asked the monks in his temple, who are these guys across the road? And they said, I don't really know. And then my friend said, well, how long have they been there? And the guy said, about 500 years. Now, that is, it's quite amusing, but it does actually, unfortunately, illustrate the fact that Buddhism, like any kind of religious grouping, tends to become very isolated, tends to become very closed in on itself. Now, this is also something I think that is more characteristic of Europe than the United States. When I go to the United States, and my work is far better known in America than it is in Europe, I enter into a Buddhist culture that in many ways has transcended its sectarian identities. And I think this has been brought about to some extent because of the sheer number of Buddhists in America, but that has been facilitated by magazines like Tricycle Magazine or Buddha Dharma. Some very good publications are now being available which are not representing the views of particular schools. Now in Europe there's much less of that, partly because we speak so many different languages. Just economically it's difficult to produce a journal like that. We do find in Germany Buddhismus Aktuell, for example, which is cross-disciplinary, which is very good. But I have the sense when I'm in the States that I'm interacting and collaborating with Buddhists from across the spectrum. And at some level, they identify as being American Buddhist, let's say, primarily, and only secondarily, well, I belong to the Zen school or the Tibetan school or something. I'm sure there's sectarianism going on in America as well, but it's, from my perspective, it's much less pronounced. There's a much greater sense of American Buddhists feeling that they're somehow in this together. And I find that very inspiring. So I think you have to be careful of using this word, the West, because what's going on in the different European countries is not at all comparable to what's currently emerging in America.
What do you think, what are the, if we have this dialogue, what are the mines, the landmines in this discussion, the really problematic things, what, for example, find traditionalists problematic on what you as writing and saying in your books, and what is the what are aspects you think that there's energy that flows, so that this brings us together. So
the fact that Buddhists disagree with each other is not in itself a bad thing. In fact, it's this kind of disagreement and conflict that leads to debate and to reflection, and potentially it leads to new things. It leads to a new emergence of different understandings and forms and practices. So conflict and disagreement is fine. The problem I find, let's say in relation to some of my own work, is that I publish ideas that many Buddhists probably don't like at all, but rather than engage me in discussion, they ignore me. In fact, very often I don't get any response at all to my work, except what I call the silent closing of doors. In other words, I find myself excluded from various fora, and that I think is very sad, because it seems to be somehow against the actual tradition itself, which is one of examination, critical inquiry. All traditions will give some lip service to this, but in practice there's a reluctance to really challenge certain sacred cows, like reincarnation, for example. And so again, it's the same tension. There is sectarianism, there's a closed-mindedness, an insecurity, a fear on the one hand, and yet on the other hand we find mind and life. We find Mathieu Ricard discussing with his father, the monk and the philosopher. We find both dimensions taking place. Dialogue on the one hand and refusal of dialogue on the other. How this will play out, I don't know.
What are the holy cows?
The holy cows.
So what are the subjects why people closing the door?
Well, one of the big problems in Buddhism is whether or not, as a Buddhist, one is required to accept the cosmology of ancient India. In other words, the belief in reincarnation, in a law of karma that somehow drives evolution, drives the fate of beings of all kinds, that the goal of Buddhism is the freeing of oneself from the cycle of birth and death. All of these ideas are not exclusively Buddhist ideas. These are characteristic of Hinduism, of Jainism, of Buddhism. In other words, they are features of Indian cosmology, Indian soteriology. They belong to the ancient Indian world, and I frankly do not feel they have any real place any longer in contemporary spiritual or religious practice. So the sacred cows are really the views of ancient India that have been regarded by Buddhists for many centuries as integral to the teachings of the Dharma. I would argue that the teachings of the Dharma are quite independent from the cultural worldview of reincarnation, karma, different realms of existence, and so forth and so on. And that's a big issue. And I don't think it's an important debate. It's something that's not going to get resolved in the short term. But at some point, I think traditional Buddhists will have to face these questions and respond to them, in an articulate way. I have yet to read a book, a modern book on Buddhism, that defends the doctrine of reincarnation. It's just assumed. Nobody tries to argue for it, that I'm aware of. And I think perhaps the reason for that is because it's a very difficult thing to make a compelling argument for, given what we know from the natural sciences, human evolution, the structure of the brain. Reincarnation is very difficult to fit with that worldview.
Maybe we look a little bit to these three holy cows.
Okay.
Yeah. So actually, reincarnation is one point. Like I told you, I have listened to a lot of your talks and have studied you intensively. And there was one, not much sequences. I get a little bit, I could say, a little bit of painful feeling. So one of the situations I remember really clearly, you were saying some people take the example of Mozart for say reincarnation is real. Yeah. And I do not see your face in this moment, but the whole of the class is laughing. Yeah? And actually this is a moment, actually I won't prepare me to give it, to listen to you. My story is that I'm studied philosophy and politics, and I was always convinced that reincarnation, like you, is a myth. But through my own experience, I'm in this uncomfortable situation that I have seen past lives, and I have no good other theory than there are past lives of me. So, and from this view, I ask myself why you let this question not more open. That you not argue much on this topic. Actually, it's not your topic. Your topic, I feel, is more what you call the spiritual professionals and what all comes with this and what you have changed in the sutras and all. I think you are expert in this, but you're not an expert in reincarnation, yes or not. So my feeling is why you not let it more open. Why you not can say now to the record, there are some also good possibilities for it. Could it be you have a small kind of trauma from your early times in Dharamsala on this topic?
To be quite honest, I'm sick and tired of talking about it. Because it's not, I think to me the issue is not whether there is or whether there isn't reincarnation. I can live with either. I just don't think it's relevant, frankly, to how we live our life here and now. And I'm basically agnostic on reincarnation. It would be arrogant for me to say there is no such thing. I don't know. But given what I have studied, given what reports I've heard from children who remember their past lives, I'm still not persuaded that this is the case. Let's say, for example, that you or someone else remembers a past life. Okay, that may be the case. But that in itself doesn't really prove much at all. It proves that that may be a possibility, but to argue from that you will be born again, for example, after death, there's no justification in that, saying that at all. But the Buddhist belief is far more than that. The Buddhist belief, or the Hindu belief, is that we have been born and reborn since beginningless time. And we will continue to be born and reborn until we find a way through the practice of the Dharma to liberate ourselves from that cycle of birth and death. That's the big picture reincarnation. So the empirical evidence, or let's say people's personal experience, is interesting. It could well be valid, but it does not provide a very solid foundation for then drawing very general conclusions about the nature of the universe, the nature of consciousness, the nature of lives going on and on and on until it's interrupted by liberation from samsara. It may be the case. But frankly, I think all of this is going in a direction that is simply not relevant, really, to what the core teaching of the Dharma is about, and that is to come to terms with our existence here and now, to learn to respond to our dukkha, our suffering and the suffering of others, in a way that's wise and compassionate, to create communities, to live a good and ethical life. And that's what matters. And if there is rebirth, I can't think of a better way to prepare for it than to lead an ethical life, which is the standard Buddhist teaching.